I work for an organisation called Sussex Community Development Association, which is New Haven on the south coast of England in East Sussex. SCDA was commissioned by our county council to deliver one of 5 district and borough food partnerships. So as part of my role as the community development programme manager at SCDA, I also chair the Lewes District Food Partnership, and I'm really lucky to be still very heavily involved in that work. And then I've got a kind of slightly new role as well, which is along with members of Lewes District Food Partnership, we have founded the Alliance Food Support, which is a piece of work which I'm really delighted has now got national scope. So also kind of primarily here in my role as the co-founder of the Alliance for Dignified Food Support, but just a bit of background for where that's come from and my other roles as well. Okay, so today's session, we are going to talk about background for Dignified Food Support came about, and it very much came about as a partnership piece of work. So I'll kind of be singing the praises of SFP today and food partnerships more broadly, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the sort of players and how it all came together. On trauma, I work very closely with Carl Walker, who's a community psychologist, his work, but I'll be sharing a kind of synopsis of it and some further reading if you want to learn more on hunger trauma. Then I'm going to move on to the Alliance itself, principles of dignified food support that we have come up with, along with a series of evidence recommendations for community support organisations who are looking to centre dignity in their. And then finally, we'll be looking at the development of a Dignity Toolkit, something that can be shared with frontline organisations who are really looking to kind of move their practices. That might be as part of an exit strategy. You know, we know that a lot of food banks now are moving out of this sector within the next few years. So it might form part of an exit, or it might form part of a transition to a community food hub or more sustainable food support. So that's the kind of the context for the day. Okay, start with background. First of all, I thought I'd just introduce you really briefly to the team. Although I would say that this work has come about as a result of a lot more than this. I know I can see that there's some people in the webinar today who've participated in workshops and conversations over the last 2 years, pulling this piece of work together, but been led along with myself by these 3 other people. So we've got Jane Perry, who is an independent social researcher. She's also chair of a community project within Lewes District, and everybody within the Alliance team has that experience working. But Jane is also the author of For Emergency Use Only, which was a report that was 10 years ago by Trussell Trust, Church Action on Poverty and others that led direction of Feeding Britain. So it was a really kind of seminal piece of work in the kind of food space. So again, I'll share links to that later. We've also got Ronald Ford. He's an academic and a former chef. He's also chair of a food project locally, but he's done lots of research into the impact of alternative models of community food support, so social supermarkets and community food hub, that sort of thing. And then finally, Carl Walker, who I've already mentioned, is a community psychologist who specialises in hunger trauma and the impact of relying long on food aid and what that does to people's psychology, and really that informed practice and that awareness of how stigmatizing a reliance on aid can be is what really directly led to the formation of the Alliance and this piece of work. So how did this project come about? It came directly out of a food summit. Many of you in the room today will have led your own food summits or be working on a food summit for this year. And I just kind of want to champion them really, because we're moving on to our food summit this year in Lewes District. But our first one was in October 2022. I invited both Carl and Ronald along to speak about their respective work. Hunger trauma, Ronald on his evaluation of the community supermarket model. In all honesty, I was a little bit nervous about that. I knew that we were going to have quite a large number of bank volunteers at the summit. And I really didn't want to ostracize them or feel that we were criticizing the work that they had done. But I also thought that Carl and Ron were really interesting things to say about the way that food and community food support inadvertently can perpetuate harm and cause stigma and a loss of dignity. The response was phenomenal, actually. There wasn't that defensiveness at all. And in fact, volunteers really want to do something with this. You know, we know 100% that this is an issue. This loss of dignity that you're talking is a massive issue that we see every day, but we just don't have time to do anything about it. And since then, countless conversations with people who volunteer or work within community food organisations, and this is what was coming through loud and clear. It's like they know that this is an issue, they want to do something about it, but volunteers are already burnt out, especially in entire-led services. You know, they're very focused on the delivery and just getting the food parcels together, serving their communities. They don't really have the time or the bandwidth to sort of step back and think about this a little bit more deeply. So what they asked us to do was a piece of work that specific recommendations and help them to move forward. I should say that this work is really indebted to the work that Nourish have done in Scotland. I don't know if we've got any people from Scotland today, but obviously the Scottish setup is really different because the Scottish government have committed to moving beyond food banks and have Nourish to do some of this work, as well as working closely with IFAN on a cash first methodology. So it's slightly different in England and Wales, and we didn't want to dupe what Nourish is doing, and we wanted to build on it and learn from it, but we also wanted to be a little specific in our recommendations, because that's what food banks and other organisations were really asking for. Tell us exactly what to do. So we came up with this series of evidence-based. The methodology was working, it was very collaborative, it was very participatory. We held a series of workshops at Kingston in London, and then we were having a second series of workshops with national partners. So from the beginning, very closely with our neighbours, Brian and Hove Food Partnership, who many of you will be familiar with. We worked very with Church Action on Poverty, who run the Your Local Pantry network, already thinking a lot about dignity in that work. And we worked very closely with Andrew at Feeding Britain, who has really endorsed and supported us. And then Sustainable Food Places have given invaluable feedback. Isabel Ross at Sustain gave us some really, really excellent feedback. We also did have conversations with IFAN as well, so we consulted quite extensively with them. Sabina IFAN, again, gave some really great feedback. And then just to briefly touch on why this work is important, I would imagine that most of you know why it's important. I think we are really at a bit of a turning point, especially election of a new government, where we are all in agreement that as the Labour Party, the kind of mass dependency on emergency food parcels needs to be ended, and the stigma that creates for people who are living in poverty or who are on low income and rely on food aid to support themselves is not a great outcome. So I just want to be really clear from the outset that as an alliance, we don't champion food support as to poverty. So what we're not saying is that more or better food banks or any kind of support is going to be a sustainable solution to the chronic poverty that many people are living in the UK. But we're also aware that there are over 2,000 food banks. And so in the meantime, while we work collectively on an exit strategy and those wider anti-poverty solutions, we'd like to see if we can make that as dignified as possible for people so that it isn't kind of preparing harm. So that's a little bit of background. Okay, so as I said, it's very much built on the work of community psychologist Carl Walker, who coined this phrase. Carl himself co-founded a non-referral food Worthing in West Sussex. So he has that frontline experience, and he works really closely with service users and volunteers to try and capture their experience of using food support. And what he found the impact was very, very similar to a trauma that people would experience, you know, any other kind of trauma, like surviving a natural disaster, or, you know, life challenge, that acute trauma that people are experiencing. Different to, although can coexist with, anxiety and depression. And he talks about this importance of not looking at it just being rooted in the use of food aid and food insecurity, but the way that that is linked often to other issues. So I'm sure that you will see service users that you have, or the users of community food support, who have these kind of multiple needs, that it's not kind of food poverty as a distinct, isolated issue, but it's linked to lots of issues, and how these issues are inherently political and economic and so Carl did all of the photos, by the way, in this section. These are all photographs that were taken by participant research to try and capture their experience of using the community food support. And as I say, I've tried to include as many quotes from those participants as possible which really informed our work. So one of his participants said, "We were both just getting bad mentally with our health, to the point that at one point, September last year, both of us at separate occasions off the bridge because we couldn't cope with anything anymore." And I think it really is just showing that kind of sharp of the reliance, the dependency on food aid, that dehumanizing effect of hunger, of feeling stripped of social value, and that indignity, guilt, shame, and the kind of loyalty that can come along with that. And I find this fascinating. That I'm sure that all of you within this space are nodding along, and you know this, but I'm still shocked by, when I talk to volunteers at food banks across the country, how many people still really worry that the system is open, or that, you know, people might come to a food bank when they don't really need to. It's that kind of disconnect between understanding how challenging it be to not be able to afford to meet your basic needs and needing to access charitable support. The idea that if we make it too quote unquote easy, that that system is open to abuse. Whereas we found the opposite, you know, that stigma is really such a huge barrier. It kind of puts people off. And I know that there was a recent DWP survey that of all of the people in the UK who reported experiencing hunger within the last month, only 14% had actually accessed a food bank. See that, you know, the people actually accessing that food aid is really the tip of the iceberg. Carl also talks about food identity and status. You know, we know the social importance of being able to go out for food, of being able to invite other people over to your home to share food, especially, you know, as a family, having family meals, being able to feed your children. All of these things are so bound up with our identity and our status that if we're able to do those things, again, it's that dehumanizing effect. And in particular, reliant on a stranger who chooses your food for you, and you're not given a choice, what that feels like to you, especially if potentially you're then expected to perform gratitude, or you're framed as ungrateful if you don't want the things that somebody has chosen for you. That impacts your identity. And also, we'll get to this later on in the session, the nature of the referral system, which is still very, very common in the community food sector, of people having to go to a professional to ask for that referral, and then really feel that they're expected to kind of perform their poverty and prove that enough, and the fear that comes along with worrying that that will away from you, that you won't achieve the referral, or you won't be given that support. And that puts people in, they feel really unable to share their successes or any progress or those positive aspects, because they're afraid that if they do share the fact that they've got a job, for example, or that has gone on, or they're going on holiday, that then immediately that's withdrawn. And it's this idea of having to perform your poverty, perform the gratitude for the support that you're getting, and the inadequacy that that can cause. Before we kind of get into the principles, I just wanted to touch on the fact that food support organisations vary significantly. We know already that lots and lots of organisations are already doing this work. I'll ask you later in the session to share examples of good practice, because we know that those are in place all over the country, people who are thinking about how to embed a social aspect in their support, that they are providing people with choice, that they're making the experience as positive as it can be. But obviously, the community food support sector is not regulated, although I would argue that it is supplementing the welfare state. It's certainly supplementing statutory services areas, even with regards to supporting people with their mental health and issues outside food. But what support you get and what that might look like is a complete postcode. So again, one of the roles of the Alliance is to try and provide some sort of consistency. This isn't going to be a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, and what works for one organiser may not work for another, but it's giving some suggestions so that we can all collectively work towards good practice. I'm going to end with this section with a few quotes. So this, again, is somebody's experience of accessing food support, that it's crucifying. I stuck it out and went through things, and then they had some frozen stuff there, and they had it all out on the table, and she said, pick what you want. So I went to pick up a pack of 4 burgers or something like that, and she said, oh no, that's for families, and took it in hand. Well, I nearly bloody died. I was mortified, and she literally snapped it out of my hand. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm never doing this again. And I cried all the way home. And how many of you that kind of resonates with, or how many times you might have seen something. Again, this might be a volunteer doing their absolute best to ensure that the food is given out fairly, prioritised, but it's the impact of these interactions on those people who access support. I think the whole idea that you have to queue up to get something to you, that, you know, it's not easy to ask for help, it's not easy to put your hand up, and then always worrying in the queue that somebody is going to drive past that you know from work or from your job, or, you know, how do you explain that? It's somebody going to phone my door in your mum at the food bank queue. It's just constant. And I don't know if it's just me. It might be just me, but it just wasn't comfortable with the whole experience at all. And I would avoid it. And again, I wonder if many of you have worked with organisations where, again, they don't be queuing outside. They have thought about how they might be able to do things differently, but the stigma of having to queue up to get the food that you have the right to access, that does to people. Last one, I felt very worried going in. I thought, do I need to give false in case they actually report me and say, this woman can't afford pasta, can you take her son away? I was. So again, it's just this profound sense of shame and worry, which really kind of contrasts with the idea that, you know, people who are the piss and accessing multiple food banks because it's an easy way to get food. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of contrast that perception with these quotes. The last thing I'll briefly talk about from Carl's research is the new research around moral injury in community food support. So he's really moved away from working with the recipients of food support, and he's now working really closely with his staff. And this term moral injury is used to refer to people that work in the NHS, for example, and it's when you know what you should be doing to provide adequate care for somebody, but that your work is structured makes it impossible for you to do that. And so it's this that can occur, and the way that you're having to work actually goes away to your own ethical and moral code. He talks about this betrayal, and that individuals feel like they have to take responsibility for that humiliation and trauma that people are experiencing, and the potential might then begin absorbing that trauma and emotional work burnout. And we know that the majority of community food support is provided by volunteers, and the risk of emotional burnout, the risk that they will experience that kind of secondary or vicarious trauma is really, really high. So when we get to the principles of dignified food support and some of the recommendations that we make, One of the things that we're really clear about is that we don't want this to just be another to-do list. Here's another set of things that volunteers have to do in addition to providing food and, you know, often providing ad hoc mental health support. You now have to do this whole list of things. It's dignified as well. Actually, it's far better if this work starts with looking at staff and volunteer well-being and making sure that they are supported, that they have, because if volunteers and staff feel well supported, they then have energy and that ability to be able to support their community members, their service users. So I kind of hope that that comes through and it doesn't kind of feel like, oh God, here's things to do. It just feels really overwhelming. You know, we've deliberately put together a kind of menu of suggestions. So for organisations, just take maybe one or two simple things away. It's just nudging everybody in this right direction and trying to avoid this kind of moral injury, as Carl describes it, that can be experienced by doing something that they kind of know isn't quite the right thing. And that takes its toll on them personally. Really briefly, I know that everybody in this room knows the scale of the problem. I've already quoted Department for Work and Pensions Family Resources survey, but I just also want to flag the statistics that really look at the way that different margin groups can disproportionately experience these issues. So Food Foundation looks at with disabilities and how more likely they are to experience food insecurity. And then the Trussell Trust recently found that more than a quarter of people who identify as LGBTQ+ reported experiencing food insecurity, a disproportionate number. So again, I just wanted to flag, obviously there's other marginalised groups that experience food in disproportionately high numbers as well. And we've really tried to factor that in to the recommendation. Okay, I think we are going to jump to a micro activity. Andrea, are you with me and can you pop it in the chat?
Yep, I will do that now.
Brilliant.
The link is here.
Okay, so in the chat, I've put a link to our Miro board, which is what we're using to get feedback for today's session. If you could click it and access it, and you should see that says rose, thorn and bud. Many of you will have done a similar sort of activity. I've kind of gone through all the really dark stuff. I've started with the kind of the context, which is grim. So we're going to do the thorn activity first. If I could get some thumbs up from people just to say if you have managed to click on that and access the Miro board, helpful.
I think what I'll do is share my screen so you can see it.
Perfectly. So there's that, the middle section, or I can see it popping about there. All right, I'll try everything down. So we're looking at that middle section, thorn, where there's some blue post-it notes. You can grab more post-it notes from the side. In the left-hand column, there's a little icon, post-it notes. If you could grab a blue one, because that will keep my nice orderly brain happy. This section. And what we're going to think about is some of the challenges that we've talked about. Sharing experiences, either from your own organisation or from an organisation that's maybe part of your food network. I'd really appreciate if we kept this one anonymous, obviously, because we're sharing maybe things we haven't felt so comfortable with. So on those post-it notes, I'd really like to know if any of that has resonated with you. What are the challenges you're seeing in the organisations that you're working with? And it could be you've seen is kind of routinely done that you think kind of creates a bit of a loss of dignity, creates stigma. Or in this section, you might want to acknowledge, yes, some of the organisations that you're working with or your own organisation does do things that you necessarily the absolute best, but what are the barriers to doing things differently? What are the, you know, is it, for example, just a loss of time? Is it about leading within your organisation that makes it really difficult to kind of change things? So I would say if you could just share an example of something that you think creates a kind of loss of dignity and a challenge changing that. Brilliant. Yeah, someone talking about queuing outside in cold, wet weather while community space is available. And you can see that you're adding the challenge. A lot of people find there isn't anywhere else for them to queue, and they've tried to dissuade them from queuing. Yeah, the limitation food bank being reminded on the first visit you can only use this service 2 more times in the next period. Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's that fear, isn't it? Of maybe you don't need 6 weeks all in one go, and then what's going to happen after those 6 weeks? And it's interesting because I've heard from locations that they might be moving away from that 6 weeks, but it's to what communicated to people using the service, because it might be on an ad hoc basis. We say, oh, we'll just let them if they need to. But is that communicated? Are people told you are going to be able to attend for as long as you want to? Or are you told you're going to be able to attend for 6 weeks and then it is being extended, but you're not quite sure why or if that's going to stop? That's interesting. Somebody said the reluctance to want to look at alternatives to food banks as it will take away their jobs. Okay, so I'm interested on volunteers who are kind of, this gives me a sense of purpose, and so actually the idea of existing is quite difficult, or is it literally paid work?
Steph, it's John here.
Yeah, John, was that you? Did you want to chip?
So I just cannot get into this post-it note thing at all. Might be my software, but we are not a food bank. We're a pantry. It's a pay-as-you-can service, which is normally £5 a bag. That works very well in the way we're doing it. I totally understand people queuing outside community centres. We're doing everything we can to alleviate that, especially in Welsh Wales, where it's very, very wet. But Steph, can somebody tell me how to get onto this?
Yeah, Andrea will be able to support you.
Thank you. Sorry, Steph.
But yeah, absolutely. And again, yeah, just want to acknowledge that there is a huge range of community food support organisations are doing this work and are doing absolutely brilliantly. And this very much isn't about diversity. You know, it's just about seeing how can we support everybody to nudge their practice forward.
Great.
John, so you should just be able to put it in your browser, and what happens when you do that? Just the link. It should just bring up.
It's not. I can't. Something. I'm on the screen. I can see you. Are we one-to-one, or am I still?
If you want to put your comment in the chat, and then Andrea can add it.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the easiest.
Okay,
yeah.
We'll do. Sorry.
Some people have.
Okay. Feel free to link to the Miro board as we go. But I'm going to go on to what we can do differently. I really want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. Then I'm going to get to the kind of the principles of dignified food support. Hopefully you have all received a copy from Andrea of the principles and recommendations. And again, not Andrea, if you could, or let's see if I can add it to the chat as well. Okay, I'm going to pop. I'm not sure that's going to work, but we'll see. Okay, but there's a PDF, and I'll have included on the last slide for you, and we can follow up with an email. So we had many workshops, both with grassroots local organisations, people that use community food support, and then those kind of national organisations to pull this together. And we came up with principles, which I'm going to go through shortly. And then underneath each principle are a long list, actually, of recommendations. These are all based, these have all come from either the people who use the food support themselves, the volunteers, kind of working in that sector, and to think about how we can centre dignity in ways. As I've said, this is not meant to be a one-size-fits-all. Already be doing lots of these things already, and for lots of you but they're just not possible. And I don't want people to kind of feel dejected and say, oh, they're saying that this is the best thing to do that because we don't have the space or we don't have the resources. So it's about finding a few things that might work for you. And as I said, everybody's practice. So it's really just food for thought. But let me take you through the 4 principles that we came up with. So the first one is about being welcoming, and that's about providing an inclusive and welcoming space, minimizing the barriers to access, and providing spaces to share food. So that's about really thinking how you as an organisation might make your space warm, welcoming, inviting. That might be, I'm thinking of Brighton, for example, in Brighton, that's got really gorgeous branding and lovely aprons and cards, and all of their kind of marketing and messaging feels really positive and a member of something. So it might be as simple as those sorts of things. Might be taking active steps to show people from marginalised communities and minoritized that they are welcome. We've done a lot of work in this process with Church Action on Poverty. I know that so many community food support organisations are based in faith-based institutions such as churches, and the kind of complications that can cause, and needing steps like displaying the progress pride flag, for example, or resources in different languages, those kind of really small things that can make a big difference in terms of inclusion. It might be encouraging volunteers to learn community members' names or providing name badges for the volunteers. And it's about setting, I think this is probably the crux of it really, setting that positive and respectful tone and with regards to community members and how they're talked about. You know, even when they're not there, how do volunteers talk about those people who are accessing the support which is being used? How are we kind of challenging any of those misconceptions, taking that more trauma-informed approach? The next principle is to be, so this one is really about offering clarity about what those providers receiving support can expect, providing information about the community food project, how it works and why. So again, this is kind of what I was touching on. Lots of organisations tell you you can have 6 weeks of support, but then on a ad hoc basis might let you access the support for much longer. And it's about that transparency and being really, really clear. So, for example, an organisation might make a capacity so that they know exactly how many community members they can support at any one time, plan in place for what they will do if numbers begin to exceed those limits. And it's about communicating to the members and to the volunteers so that everybody knows, and there's some forward planning there. We know that there's huge demand on these organisations, and I think that a huge amount of anxiety, especially for volunteers, if they see their numbers going up and up and up and up, sure how they're going to be able to cope with that. And so what we recommend is this really transparent approach. You know, we can support, for example, 40 households a week, and that's what we need to do in order for our organization to be sustainable. And these are the boundaries around what you're going to be able to do, and this is what you can expect when you come to us. So it's just about kind of communicating, being really clear organisations' aims and mission and values, and also the organisation's procedures and governance. I think this is particularly important for, you know, groups where they might not have a board of trustees, for example. You know, what is the governance structure? These decisions being made, are there ways that volunteers and community members can get involved in that decision-making process? Or could you host regular volunteer community member meetings to communicate any key decisions about the service? And I think being really transparent about the limitations again of the service. We know that in dwindling supply, I saw that come up on the MyRow board a couple of times, and again that's a real concern. And I've spoken to lots of food banks where the amount of money that they're paying on food a week in order to kind of maintain their stock is astronomical. It can be up to £1,000 a week, which just isn't financially sustainable. I think it's that transparency of what people can expect, making, you know, members, community members aware that there isn't a kind of a bottomless food, and if you're putting boundaries in place around what people are able to access, it's constraints. So it's really about encouraging that transparency and communication. So that's principle 2. The third principle, oh, I'm going the wrong way. The third principle is around being person-centered. So this is very much about ensuring that the interactions are respectful, compassionate. We talk quite a bit about safeguarding, the importance of safeguarding. We know that obviously a lot of community food support organisations across the working with vulnerable groups, vulnerable adults, that it's important that those safeguarding and processes be embedded. And then this is a real critical one for me, where possible, and we know it's possible, but where possible, offering a choice of food or the provision of vouchers and hardships instead of food. And again, in the further reading that I've got at the end of this, I'll refer to IFAN's work around cash first approaches. And that actually, you know, if you are a nation that's spending vast quantities of money on food just from the supermarket, so the supermarket from that, just so a huge team of volunteers can package it up and hand it out, that actually, if there is that money available, could that be used to set up a hardship grant for people in crisis instead? Could community members be given vouchers in food parcels so they have that autonomy to go out and purchase food themselves? So be looking in terms of person-centered, it's about choice, autonomy, agency, and I think it's about trusting people who are in food insecurity that actually they are able to manage a budget, they're able to manage a short budget much better than a lot of people giving that. And so it's about that kind of trust that they are able to know what's appropriate for them. More of these recommendations in the PDF that I've linked in the chat. But yeah, the kind of choice, and again, just to sort of touch on as well, that sort of suits the people who are within your community, being mindful that plus food, that can be really, really challenging. So it's thinking about ways that you might do that. And then the final principle of dignified food support is empowering. So this is offering opportunities for staff, volunteers and members to share their views so that people with direct and relevance can contribute and are involved in decision making. Creating opportunities for members to contribute in a range of ways. That could be money, it could be time, it could be skills. For example, we work really closely with projects that operate on a pay-as-you-feel basis. Nice way of kind of having that reciprocity. And we know from community members, pay-as-you-feel organisations, that can give them a real sort of sense of dignity, pride, because being a passive recipient of charitable aid doesn't feel, actually, it might feel better to somebody to be able to throw in a handful of coppers or to pay, you know, or, you know, £30 worth of food than it is just to receive that. But also they might be able to contribute in other ways, like volunteering, supporting with cooking, donating their skills. I know that an organisation where there's few members that donate plant cuttings on a weekly basis and they're to share with the community. So that's just kind of building in that reciprocity and ways for people to contribute. But some of the other recommendations are, you know, to consider ways they might be able to get involved with the direction of the project. So maybe you have a STIP that's made up of community members. And it's also about avoiding that utilising language when talking to or about community members, ensuring that volunteers give everyone a warm and friendly welcome, including, again, learning community member names. Well, I think small things like that are really, really important. Before I get you to do the second Miro board activity, I just want to flag this. This is co-produced with the users of community food support. This is a Dignity chart that is specifically aimed at people accessing support. It's available on our website and can be printed out to new members or displayed within organisations. And it's, again, it's about transparency and that kind of empowerment, and it's telling people what they can expect, which is dignity and respect, a welcoming and inclusive space, clarity about rules, procedures, a choice of food, to be kept safe, not to be judged for using others. This is something that came up time and time again with participants saying, you know, they felt really judged if they were using 2 different food banks, but actually if they're being given pre-packed food parcels and a lot of that's appropriate for them, going to 2 different places and kind of taking the best bits is really resourceful. So really, that was really important. The ability to ask questions or and to be able to contribute where possible. And as I say, that's in a range of ways. With each of those on our website and give a much more detailed explanation of what that might look like in practice. But I just wanted to flag that that is available as a download. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing again. Can we go back to the Miro board, please? And this time, hopefully, as I've been talking about those kind of good practice and dignified food support and the sorts of things that we can do to dignity and reduce stigma, I'm hoping that lots of you are thinking, oh, I know does that really, really well. Or there's something that we do at our particular project really well. It might be something I've mentioned, it might be something different, but something that an organiser is doing. This time, obviously, you don't need to be anonymous. Please celebrate those organisations that are really, really well. And in the Rose section on the pink post-it notes, if you examples of good practice, if you're not able to answer the Miro board, feel free to put them in the chat and we can add them to a post-it note. But yeah, let's just spend a few minutes sharing positives on what you see going well in your area. Yeah, someone's talking about co-located services. This is something I'm hearing a lot. It's about food almost being the conduit and get the thing that gets people in the door, but then once they're in, kind of access to a whole range of things, some of them are advice services, but also some really positive things as well. You know, like being able to access a growing project through Food Hub or a clothing exchange. So yeah, that kind of co-location I think can work really well if there's scope to do that. I'm loving this example of service. That sounds incredible. And yeah, and I think this idea that it can to people who might have a range of kind of complex needs and experiences of different forms of stigma and marginalization is really important, rather than, I remember, I hear it quite so much anymore, a real emphasis on people wanting to go, the food to go to the people in most need. I think it's really difficult to kind of establish who is in most need when there's a whole range of different needs, including social ones, or marginalization, that might go hand in hand with that kind of food insecurity. That's great to hear. You've got an environment where people are really happy to tell you about the positives. That's good. So you've obviously cultivated where there isn't that fear that they will be sent back for another, having to prove that they're still in sufficient need to access support. Okay, I really want to make sure that there's at least a couple of minutes at the end for a few questions. So I'm going to just move on to the last little section. So if you have been inspired by this work, if that's something you want to get further, either as a food partnership or as a standalone organisation, or council or whatever organisation you are here at, we are in the process of developing a Dignity Toolkit on the principles. So the toolkit is it's drafted, it's just nicely designed, ready to go on the website, and it includes an audit. So that's just a really simple way of going through each of the recommendations in turn, looking at what you already do, what you'd like to try, and then maybe which of them aren't appropriate for you as a mission. So it starts with an audit. The audit then allows you to put together an action plan. The recommendations that you're not already doing but are interested in can then form the basis of an action plan. We've got a template available to support you to kind of think about the timeline for each who might be responsible, any support that you would need, and putting it together. And then we've also got some tools for reflection, because obviously, of course, if you're making changes, that there's time and space to kind of reflect on the changes that have been made, impact spin. So what the challenges have been around implementing, but what the successes are. And again, really keen that people are kind of trying some of these things. It might, you know, by all means, we'd love to hear that, you know, we tried to do that, it just didn't work. But then we tried something else and it worked really, really well. So again, not a one size fits all. And we hope that this toolkit will give organisations that kind of real flexibility. I just wanted to come back to this quote that's on our website and just really reiterate that staff and volunteers within community food support organisations are already under immense pressure. I know not news to anyone in this space. They're at high risk of burnout. So our aim is not to add another long list of things to do. Lots of our recommendations focus on volunteer wellbeing. And as I say, when people are putting together their action plans, we would really encourage you to kind of maybe choose no more than 5 to begin with that you might want to have a go at doing. Maybe identifying some that are real quick wins that you can just do straight, and whilst others might be a bit more ambitious and longer term. So our hope for the future, we're looking at our minds, I suppose, as many of us are on systemic change at the moment. We've got a new place. There's obviously a huge conversation going on at the moment at a national level about removing the 2-child cap from child benefits, which would make a real difference to many people and those families that we know community food support organisations are supporting. So we want to change a national policy that tackle the root causes of poverty. I hope, though, that we can support service model change. As I say, there are still over 2,000 in the UK and a hugely increasing number, which is brilliant to see, of projects, pantries, social supermarkets, etc. We'd love to see more of those affordable food schemes, first initiatives to reduce the burden on emergency food providers. I'm thinking a lot about exit strategies and what a food bank would need in order to feel confident they can withdraw. And I'm thinking we've still got a really long way to go on that, but surely part of the solution is the community being bolstered by more affordable food schemes and initiatives that kind of reduce that burden. And then the third change that we're looking at, change. And so hopefully there's been a bit of food for thought today. Maybe I've shifted that a little bit on something, or you've got a message that you can take along to your next emergency food meeting or your next food partnership meeting, and the development of more informed practice. So going right back to the beginning around Carl's work and really acknowledging that as an experience and making sure that that really informs service delivery. So hopefully our recommendations will support you to do that, and then reduce potential for harm done to people accessing food support. So just got a link here if you want to access our website. I've got my email address there if you questions you want to follow up, and there's also a link which I'll share again after to complete our online form. That will mean that you can be notified as soon as the toolkit goes live, which will hopefully be in the next few weeks. And then we'll share these slides, and it's got absolutely tons and tons. This is the joy of working with a team of academics, loads and loads of further reading and references that if you're interested in where this has come the research that backs up our practice, it's all there for you. For the long we've got 5 minutes, could we do the final Miro board? So this is the final section, the green section, which is the bud. And something that you would take away from this session. It might be a change that you're going to make. It might be, you know, a message that you're going to take back to other people that you work with. It might, you know, just a slight mindset shift or something new that you've learned. So if you have something that you're going to take away, if you could pop it on a green post-it note in that final section, really, really helpful. And then I will also stop sharing, so that in those last few minutes, if you've got any questions and you want to put them in the chat or stuff, I'm happy to answer them. But yeah, I hope that was useful for people.